I'm Emily Hawthorne, a Middle East and North Africa analyst at Stratfor, and this podcast is brought to you by Stratfor Worldview, our premier digital publication for objective geopolitical intelligence and analyses. Individual, team, and enterprise memberships are available at worldview.stratfor.com/subscribe.
There's a glut in the sense that right now, if you talk to financiers, they will tell you there's more money ready to be invested in renewables than there are good projects.
Welcome to the Stratfor podcast from worldview.stratfor.com. I'm Ben Sheen. There are few subjects more geopolitically charged than energy. International and domestic tensions flow through the lines of regulation, import and exportation, and valuation for every type of market, from fossil fuels to renewables. Russell Gold knows this better than most. He's the senior energy reporter for the Wall Street Journal and a best-selling author. His latest book is Superpower, One Man's Quest to Transform American Energy. He recently sat down with Stratfor's Vice President of Global Analysis, Reva Goujon, for a wide-ranging conversation on his writing, his latest book, and the global outlook for energy futures. Let's go to Russell and Reva in the studio.
Hello, I'm Reva Goujon, joined by Russell Gold, an award-winning investigative journalist and senior reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Russell has developed his deep research into two compelling books on U.S. energy. The first is The Boom, which details the evolution of the U.S. shale revolution. And his newly released book, Superpower, is a story centered on an incredibly ambitious entrepreneur who has been hell-bent on trying to overhaul the U.S. power grid in favor of renewable energy. Russell, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, Russell, typically regulatory battles in the United States don't make for the most enthralling read, but you fortunately are a terrific storyteller, and you put a face to these very big, serious energy trends that we're so used to seeing captured in charts and graphs. Tell us first a little bit about the subject of Michael Skelly, your main protagonist in Superpower.
So, I started talking to Michael Skelly 4 years ago now, and I was told that I should meet him and talk to him because he was working on this big idea. And the big idea was, it's really simple in some ways. The middle of the country, the Great Plains, have an incredible wind resource and a pretty good solar resource as well. There's lots of land out there, lots of area to develop renewables. There's one big problem, and that is that there's not many people who live there. There are not many factories. There's not the demand for electricity. So the big idea was, can we build sort of a special purpose transmission line to connect Oklahoma to Memphis? Because once you get the power to Memphis and into the TVA grid, you can get to Atlanta, you can get to Washington, Philadelphia, all across the East Coast. And so he set out to do this. And people are telling me this is it's a great idea. He's pouring lots of money into it. He's got big and blue chip investors, and you should meet him. So I went and met him, and it turned out his story was even more interesting than I thought it was going to be, because not just had he been working on this big transmission idea, but this is a guy who back in 1999 started doing wind and was the chief development officer for one of the predominant wind development companies in the 2000s, built up what was called Zilka Renewables and then became known as Horizon, now part of EDPR. Just really his story from 99 to 2019 is really the story of renewables in the United States.
And we'll get more into the details of that fascinating personal story of Skelly. To take a step back first, though, it was interesting to see the relationship between your two books, right? So one on the rise of fracking, the other on the drive toward renewables. And I wanted to ask, and I think you raised this question as well in your first book, from your perspective, has the shale revolution had the effect of undermining or reinforcing the growth of renewables?
Oh, I think there's no question it's reinforced. It's propelled renewables to grow. So here's why I think that. If you're going to have a lot of renewables on your grid, which are intermittent, you're going to need a resource that's pretty nimble to jump in And brand new modern natural gas power plants are that. You can't do that with coal. You can't do it with nuclear. You just can't start and stop them very much. But a new combined cycle natural gas plant, my God, you can turn it on. You can run it at 80%, 60%. I mean, it's do whatever. So it works really well with wind. So from a grid operator's perspective, if all you had were coal plants, you couldn't put much wind or solar on there because you couldn't make the grid operate. But with a lot of gas and with the growth of natural gas, you absolutely can bring them together. The other big thing that natural gas and the rise of fracking has done is that it drove down the cost of natural gas so amazingly and has kept it so low for so long that it forced renewables to accelerate their maturity and get lower price just to compete. They couldn't get onto the grid. And increasingly, now that we're getting rid of subsidies, they have to compete head to head. And so, if natural gas was $10 per 1,000 cubic feet, which is what it was, let's see, most recently about 2008, 2009, frankly, everyone was going to be fat and happy. Electricity costs were going to be high. The economy was sort of probably be suffering under high energy costs. And renewables really wouldn't have had to do that much. Because of fracking, because of low natural gas prices, wind had to get much better much more quickly. Solar had to get much better much more quickly. It's turned them into a very competitive resource.
And so it's about finding that right cocktail of energy resources to get the stability that you need in power generation ultimately. For the benefit of our listeners, how much are renewables actually powering the Texas grid today and North America at large?
The United States, it's about 9% and growing. So it's adding about 1% a year. Texas these days, about a quarter on average. Last time I checked, it was about 23, 24%. Mostly in Texas coming from wind. So when we talk about Texas, I'm talking about the ERCOT grid. So there are portions on East Texas that aren't the ERCOT grid, but essentially that's what Texas is. And one of the things that really amazed me was when you talk to the grid operators, these behind the scenes people whose job it is to not be flashy, but to keep that grid going at 60 hertz day in and day out. They would say, look, if you had told me 10 years ago that we were going to have 5% renewables, 10%, I would have panicked. I would have said there's no way, we're going to bring the grid down, but they figured out how to do it. And now you talk to them and they say 25%, 50% on some days, sure, we know how to do this. We can handle it. It's a huge change.
And you talk about in your book how, you saw the computer models, you met with the visionaries who were doing these feasibility studies for 30% renewables integration, 50%, even 80% by the year 2026. What's your take on, what's the reality check on that when we look at a future estimate?
Here's the big takeaway. If you want to get to 100% renewables, you're going to pay for that. There's no way to get to 100% renewables without massively increasing the cost. But if you want to talk about 70 or 80%, we can get there. And not just can we get there, we can get there at today's prices or possibly even a little bit lower. That's what the computer models are telling us. And that's what the experience in Texas has been and in the other grids that are starting to bring in more and more renewables.
Cost, as you say, is a major variable in the competitiveness of renewables. And there was actually recently a Bloomberg report that was saying that in the past 9 years, the costs of electricity from wind have dropped 49% and 85% for solar power, which is substantial, obviously, and that's making those renewable sources cheaper than power coming from coal or gas-fired plants for about 2/3 of the world.
It is cheaper now in a lot of the world to go build a brand new wind farm or solar farm where there's a good resource than it is to operate an existing coal plant. So even a fully paid, fully depreciated coal plant is having trouble in some places competing with brand new wind. You need a lot fewer people to operate them. So there's lower labor costs, there's lower maintenance costs, there are fewer moving pieces so things don't break down, and there's no energy cost. You don't have to buy coal, you don't have to buy natural gas. So it's just it's a really fundamental change in the last 5 to 10 years.
And continuing to in the next.
You talk to people like you mentioned, Bloomberg, New Energy Finance, and others, and you sort of say, well, where do you bottom out? How much lower can you go? And they think probably we're starting to see about the low cost for wind, but nobody knows how much further down solar can get. What happened in solar in the last 10 years, it's a kind of simple story. China decided it was going to step in and bring economies of scale global production of solar panels. And they did that, and they just started driving down prices. And now, because of the tariffs, you've seen some of the production move to Vietnam and other places. But we have a global supply of low-cost solar panels.
Even a glut, you would argue, right?
There's a glut in the sense that right now, if you talk to financiers, they will tell you there's more money ready to be invested in renewables than there are good projects. So right now, the holdup, the bottleneck is just where are all the projects? Can you get the land? Can you get the transmission? Can you get the connections you need? If you can if you're a developer and you've got a good project, you're going to get financing for it.
I'm wondering if you can explain for a second the war of currents and how it relates to renewables expansion in the U.S. So this is a debate that goes back to the 1880s, right?
Right.
Between Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla.
Yeah.
So what are the virtues of direct current and alternate current when it comes to transmitting electricity?
So AC, alternating current, which was sort of what won out, that's what we have right now. That's what our grid operates on. It's, when you plug in, you're plugging into an AC grid here in the United States. Direct current has been more expensive, but the prices started to come down. And when you need to move power over a long distance, 300-400 miles, it's actually cheaper now to use a direct current. And the other benefit, and this is sort of an important story and something that tells me will become more important over the coming years. With an AC grid, it's really hard to control where the power goes. You just put it out onto the grid, and it's sort of like pouring a bucket of water into a lake. It sort of spreads out and goes where it goes. With DC, you can direct it. You can say, okay, I want this power to go over there. And the reason that's important is that it has what's called black start capability. And so if the grid goes down for whatever reason, a squirrel takes down a transformer and causes a third of the country to lose power, like we saw in 2003, or there's some sort of a hacking attack which brings down a grid, as we saw in the Ukraine. DC is a much better way to sort of say, okay, let's move power into this area, start up some of the fossil fuel plants, and get the grid going again. So DC has, they're just slightly different technologies. And the people I talk to say, look, we're always going to have an AC grid. Well, maybe not always. There's some people out there talking about going over to a DC grid. But having a DC overlay gives us so much more control. It's sort of, I'm trying to think what the best analogy is. It's like going from a grid you can only control by either taking electricity out and putting electricity in to having a computer which say, okay, we're going to go here, we're going to go there, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. A lot more capability
much
with DC.
More efficiency,
yeah.
Much higher voltage.
Yeah. And there's a movie coming out now about the great current war debate, going back 100 years, where Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison sort of duked it out as to whether we're going to have a DC grid or an AC grid. In some ways, it's a little weird that we have an AC grid. Your laptop, your computer runs on DC. And if you ever plug your computer into the wall and you notice that in the middle of your cord there's this little box that gets really hot, that's converting power from AC to DC. You're taking AC out of the wall, and the heat in that box is inefficiency. It's you're losing power there, and it's converting into DC, which is what you're running your computer on. So. Maybe one of these days it would be a massive investment to switch from AC to DC. I mean, sort of imagine countries that have gone from driving on the right to the left, right? And at one point, you got to make that changeover. Well, imagine having to do that, but also making billions and billions of dollars of investment. So for right now, we're stuck with an AC grid.
And that was part of Michael Skelly's challenge.
Well, exactly, because what he didn't want to do is he was talking about building a 3 to 4 gigawatt wind farm in the Oklahoma Panhandle. So just to give you an idea, a nuclear power plant, a single unit, usually about 1.2 gigawatts. Most power plants have 2 or 3 units. So that is comparable in size to a larger even than most nuclear power plants, a huge amount of power. If he just deposited it into the local grid, he would totally overwhelm the local grid. There's nothing, you just can't do with it. But with a DC current, you can just shoot it right over to Memphis nonstop, and then you drop it into Memphis. Now, there's a reason that he wanted to go to Memphis, and that is because Memphis is part of the Tennessee Valley Authority. It's the TVA grid. And back in the 70s, the TVA thought, let's go out and build like 10, 15 new nukes. And they built this great transmission system. and then they didn't build the nukes. So if you can get power into Memphis, you've got basically wide open interstate highways for electricity to get it north, east, and south, wherever you want to go.
So that's the critical node that you need to secure.
Exactly. That's what he wanted to do. That was the play.
We'll get back to Russell Gold and Reva Goujon in just one moment. The events unfolding in the Gulf region this summer really demonstrate the fraught geopolitics that surround energy and also the risks involved when diplomacy can't still troubled waters. Stratfor Enterprise and Stratfor Threat Lens help corporate security leaders pinpoint evolving global events so they can forecast and implement protective measures for their people and their businesses with the utmost confidence. If you're not already a Stratfor member, or you want to learn more about our products and platforms, then you can find more information at stratfor.com/enterprise. Now, back to Reva Goujon and Russell Gold.
Welcome back. I'm Reva Goujon, and I'm joined by Russell Gold, the author of two very important books on American energy, The Boom, and his newly released book that came out in June, Superpower. So somebody has to pay for this vision of cleaner, efficient power generation. And as you detail in your books, there's this, as to use your term, Kafkaesque battle between state and federal regulators and private business, which can be extremely fierce. So what does that mean for the investment climate in renewables?
Well, what it means and what the story of Michael Skelly and Clean Line, which was the company he co-founded, is that right now in the United States, there are private investors and there's private investment money that wants to participate, and they're having a difficult time. With Skelly, everyone calls him Skelly, so that's what I'll do. He ran into state laws in Arkansas because he was trying to cross Arkansas that just were not designed for anyone but the incumbent utility. It was a catch-22. He couldn't get in there. It took lots of time. This is a problem. I think it's a problem on a number of levels. But if we're going to bring in cleaner electricity or bring in less expensive electricity, happens to be the same thing, we're going to need to find a way to pay for it. And there's a lot, if we're going to have this energy transition, if we're going to try to meet the Paris Accords in terms of the amount of carbon and greenhouse gases, why not tap the private markets? Why not find all this private investment to bring in to pay for this? But if people have the same experience that Skelly had, just bureaucracy, red tape, officials unwilling or unable to sort of think about how to make a change, incumbent utilities throwing up roadblocks, and I could go on, it's going to have the effect of taking this investment and driving it elsewhere. And I think that's a question, that's something we need to address because, the energy transition from fossil fuels to certainly in the near term, a mix of fossil and renewables is not going to be cheap. I personally would love to see some of the pension fund money out of Canada and elsewhere investing in these projects. And they want to do that, but they're having trouble because there's so many roadblocks thrown up in their way.
And there's a contradiction there, right? As you write about, the U.S. government wants private capital to build the infrastructure, create the jobs. Congress, local governments can kill a project at the 11th hour after years of work and investment. And it's not every day you're going to find a Skelly, right?
And how frustrating is that for investors? You're putting money in, and after 10 years, you're still waiting around for some approval. The lesson here, and this is true for energy infrastructure, road infrastructure, any of the big projects we're looking at, is that there needs to be some certainty. That's not to say all these projects are going to go ahead, but at least the developers need to know, look, we're going to get a yes or no in a reasonable amount of time. And that type of regulatory certainty, it's interesting because one of the things that made fracking take off and natural gas is that they had regulatory certainty. Once the federal government made the decision, this is how we're going to treat fracking, this is how we're going to treat the water and the wastewater and the environmental permits, they stuck to it.
It just hasn't happened yet for renewables.
It's been a different treatment. And then so look at the results. Regulatory certainty allows private equity, private capital to vastly increase the amount of oil and gas production in the United States. uncertainty has stymied renewable and transmission so far. It's really almost as simple as that.
You paint this great picture of the professionalism that has entered the renewables industry when you were referencing a wind industry convention in California, and the ponytails and sandals were replaced with Europeans in designer eyewear. And so you see this trend of more serious money backing renewables. I'm also curious in what you see in the shale development in the U.S., where we've gone from kind of the scrappy producers operating in that wildcatter mentality to big companies.
Chevron being the big player in the Permian.
Much deeper pockets, higher risk tolerance, the tech expertise. What does that shift if there's a sort of passing of the reins taking place? What does that mean for the efficiency and scale of shale production moving forward?
Well, when you talk to some of the shale pioneers, and one of the things they would say is like, this can't be the provenance of the big players, because every shale well, you can go and drill a shale well here, and then you go a quarter mile down the road, and you've got to make little adjustments to have the well be profitable. And you have to be a small, nimble player to do that successfully. And that was true for a number of years. What's happening now is that we have matured enough, we figured out how to do fracking, how to design frack jobs. The big companies can come in, they've embraced this sort of more factory approach. And the biggest difference is that the small players, because they've have a track record of, frankly, burning a lot of capital and not being very profitable, Wall Street is much more worried or concerned and unwilling to give them debt or equity. But here comes Chevron, here comes Exxon, Occidental getting into it. They have better access to capital. And so they're able to come in and sort of scoop up some of this acreage, scoop up some of these players, and figure out how to do this themselves. And they've been successful so far. I mean, if you look at, the Chevron, the percentage of their oil and gas production, which is now coming from shale type play, is mostly the Permian. It's much, much larger than it used to be.
So would that mean as these bigger companies are drilling in the best spots and, maybe at a slower rate, that the rate of production increase could slow, but overall volume could still be pretty substantial?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think the rate of production, I'm not sure how much more we can get out of the Permian. And we're up to, Texas is over 5 million barrels a day, which is sort of stunning to think of. I mean, that's sort of, if Texas were a country, that'd be number 2 or number 3 in the world. I mean, it's just huge numbers. I don't know how much more Texas could go, although there's one thing I've learned having covered the fracking companies is that if you bet against shale and against fracking, it's going to be a loser's bet. It has been for a long time. They're very adept. So, I think the pace might slow, the pace of growth. But these are companies that can know how to turn on and turn off the capital. And so, even if the price goes down and they pull back, they can come roaring back if the price is warranted.
As you said earlier, China has been making very big advances in renewables and building these massive high voltage direct current power lines. And you have a great quote from the Missouri commissioner who resigned in protest after the state government shot down a plan to have a power grid run through the state. In his statement of dissent on the vote, he said, "We are like the Luddites of the 19th century, telling the world that we do not embrace new technologies. We are telling the world that we prefer central planning to free markets." And it made me think about, from China's perspective, is central planning actually an advantage here in the development of renewables?
Central planning and an ability to wipe away any kind of red tape, an ability to say, because China in some ways is like the United States. It has a great wind and a phenomenal solar resource out in the Gobi Desert, way, way out in the western part of the country. And of course, all their people and all their factories are in the east, so they need, most of them, but they needed to get the power from west to east. So they've built these enormous transmission lines and apparatus. So in that sense, the ability to have a federal government dictate and say, this is what we're going to do, has been an advantage. So, sometimes it's not the best to be the first. China's had a couple hiccups. They're trying to figure out. So the United States could learn from China. But what we need to do is figure out how to balance the federal and the state authorities when we're talking about big linear projects that can go for a couple hundred miles. And I think the solution has to be some sort of incentive for the states to get on board. I mean, we've got to give the states some reason to get excited about this and sort of say, oh, this is going to create jobs, this is going to create energy, this is what it's going to do for us. And that was what was lacking. Arkansas, which really put up the biggest roadblocks here along the way, had trouble understanding what's in it for us. And you brought up Missouri. Missouri is a sort of, we've been talking about this one line from Oklahoma to Memphis. Clean Line was actually pursuing about 4 lines at the same time. One of them went from Kansas through Missouri up into the sort of the Illinois, Indiana state line. And Missouri, much like Arkansas, they both asked the same question. Wait, we're in the middle. Right. We're not getting the jobs from the wind farms. We're not getting the power. We're just,
what do we get out of this?
Exactly. And that's been, so there needs to be a good answer for that. And right now there's not. What are so what Skelly tried to do was sort of say, all right, this is going to be a big project, and so we're going to make sure that as many of the jobs as possible go to Arkansas. The company that's going to build the steel cable, the aluminum cable that's going to go into the line, that was going to be in Arkansas. The company that was going to build the towers, 200 jobs in Arkansas. So he tried to do that. It wasn't enough. But it's a good start to sort of think about spreading the benefits.
Thanks for joining us for this conversation with Reva Goujon and the Wall Street Journal's Russell Gold, author of Superpower, One Man's Quest to Transform American Energy. We'll have details about the book in our show notes. And if you're interested in learning how Stratfor can help you with analytic tools to visualize and anticipate those areas in the world where your interests and operations are at greatest risk, be sure to visit stratfor.com/enterprise. And if you have time to leave a review on the Stratfor podcast page on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, or wherever you happen to listen, we'd love to hear your feedback. And for more geopolitical intelligence and links to our content, follow us on Twitter @Stratfor. I'm Ben Sheen. Thanks for listening.